The desert night pressed against the reinforced glass like a living thing, hungry and patient. Inside the transport vehicle, 3 people sat in a heavy silence, each lost in thoughts they would never dare speak aloud. The driver, a woman named Rebecca Torres, kept her eyes locked on the empty ribbon of road ahead, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. She was a security officer, tough and experienced, but tonight something was different. In the back seat, Thomas Webb fidgeted with his security badge, flipping it over and over between nervous fingers. He was a systems analyst, a new transfer, good with computers and bad with people, and his orders were as confusing as they were unsettling. Beside him, Dr. Helena Grant stared at a classified folder she'd already memorized. Her eyes weren't really reading anymore. They were headed to a place that officially didn't exist, to open a door that had been sealed for reasons most people would never, ever understand. Level 7. The name itself felt heavy, like speaking it aloud might summon something best left sleeping. Rebecca had worked security at this facility for 8 years, but she'd never been below level 4. The lower you went, the more classified things became. Thomas was brought here just 3 days ago, a top mind in data analysis, tasked with making sense of the impossible. Helena was the scientist, the brilliant mind who'd spent 2 long years arguing with military brass and government officials for permission to access what lay beneath. She was the one who had finally convinced them. The checkpoint appeared suddenly, a concrete bunker rising from the sand like a tombstone. Rebecca slowed the vehicle as armed guards emerged from the darkness, their faces hidden behind helmets and night vision gear. One of them approached the driver's window, and Rebecca handed over the authorization codes without a word. The guard studied them for what felt like an eternity before nodding once and waving them through. The road descended sharply, dropping into the earth through a tunnel that seemed to swallow the vehicle whole. Emergency lights flickered past in rhythmic intervals, casting everything in shades of red and shadow. Thomas stopped playing with his badge and gripped the seat in front of him instead. Helena closed her folder and tucked it into her bag, her expression unreadable in the dim light. When they finally reached the underground parking facility, the silence felt different, heavier. It was like the weight of all that rock and metal pressing down from above had somehow gotten inside their chests, squeezing the air from their lungs. They exited the vehicle and were met by a man in a crisp military uniform, his face lined with the years of keeping terrible secrets. His name tag read Morrison, but he didn't offer a first name or a handshake. He was all business. Morrison led them through a series of corridors that all looked the same stark white walls and fluorescent lighting that hummed, just slightly off-key, a dissonant sound that set your teeth on edge. They passed through 4 separate security checkpoints, each one more thorough and invasive than the last. Retinal scans, fingerprint analysis, voice recognition, and then questions about their childhoods that only they could possibly answer. It was a paranoid level of security that hinted at the scale of what they were protecting, or what they were containing. By the time they reached the elevator that would finally take them to level 7, Helena's hands were shaking slightly, though she tried her best to hide it. The elevator was old, much older than the rest of the modern facility. The buttons were chunky, mechanical things rather than digital touchscreens. When Morrison pressed the one marked with a simple number 7, the machinery groaned like something ancient, waking from a long, deep sleep. The descent took 3 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. Thomas counted the seconds in his head, anything to distract himself from the crushing sensation of moving deeper into the earth than any human was ever meant to go. When the heavy doors finally rumbled open, cold air rushed in. It carried with it the smell of ozone, metal, and something else, something primal that Helena couldn't quite identify. It reminded her of thunderstorms, of that electric moment right before lightning strikes, when the very air itself seems to hold its breath in anticipation. Morrison stepped out first, and the other 3 followed him into a corridor that looked nothing like the clean, sterile facility above. This place was older, built with different priorities by people who understood things the current generation had long since forgotten. The walls were thick, reinforced concrete, designed to survive a direct nuclear blast. The lighting was sparse, creating deep pools of shadow between each fixture, making the hallway seem to stretch into infinity. And at the far end of that corridor, maybe 100 feet away, there was something that made Helena's brilliant scientific mind stumble over itself, trying to make sense of what her eyes were seeing. It wasn't a door. It wasn't a wall. It was a seam, a crack in reality itself, running from the floor to the ceiling in a perfectly straight, razor-thin line. The space around it seemed to shimmer and distort, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt, except the air down here was cold enough that their breath came out in visible clouds. Morrison stopped about 20 feet from the seam and turned to face them. His expression was carefully neutral, but Helena caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Fear, maybe, or a profound respect for something that demanded both. He gestured toward a bank of monitoring equipment set up along one wall, screens displaying complex readings that made no sense according to any physics Helena had ever studied. "This is level 7, Morrison's voice echoed strangely in the space, as if the walls themselves were listening. "What you're looking at has been contained here since 1977. We've monitored it, studied it from a distance, but we've never attempted to interact with it directly. Until now." Thomas moved closer to the monitors, his analyst brain kicking into overdrive, trying to parse the impossible data scrolling across the screens. Temperature readings that fluctuated wildly, from near absolute zero to hundreds of degrees in seconds, with no apparent pattern. Electromagnetic signatures that just shouldn't exist in our universe. And something else, a measurement he didn't even recognize, its numbers climbing steadily higher with each passing second. "What is it?" Rebecca asked, her voice tight. Her security training was at war with every primal instinct that screamed at her to leave, to run, to get as far from this place as humanly possible. But Helena stepped forward, drawn despite herself toward the impossible thing at the end of the corridor. Her scientific curiosity was stronger than her fear. It had always been stronger, which was probably why she'd been chosen for this assignment. She pulled out a handheld scanner from her bag and pointed it at the scene, watching as the device struggled and glitched, trying to make sense of what it was detecting. "It's a tear." Helena's voice was barely a whisper, full of awe and terror. "A rupture between our reality and somewhere else. Something pushed through from the other side, and when it did, it left this behind. A wound that never healed. A scar on the fabric of space-time." "What came through?" Thomas asked, though a deep part of him screamed that he didn't want to know the answer. Before anyone could respond, the lights in the corridor flickered. Once, twice, then they steadied again. But in that brief moment of darkness, Helena saw something that made her blood run cold. For a split second, illuminated by the shimmering of the seam itself, she saw it widen, just slightly. And from the other side, from the absolute blackness within, something was watching them. She could feel its attention like a physical weight, a pressure against her mind, curious, ancient, and utterly, terrifyingly inhuman. Morrison checked his watch, his face grim. He looked at Helena with an expression that might have been sympathy. "You have 6 hours to conduct your research and document your findings," he said. "After that, this level gets sealed again, permanently this time. The brass has decided that whatever is on the other side of that thing isn't worth the risk of keeping it accessible." 6 hours, Helena thought, her mind racing. 6 hours to understand something that defied everything she knew about the universe. 6 hours to peek behind the curtain of reality and glimpse what lurked in the spaces between worlds. She adjusted her scanner, made quick notes in her tablet, and tried to ignore the growing, sickening certainty that they'd already made a terrible mistake by coming here. The seam pulsed once, a ripple of non-light that hurt to look at directly. And from somewhere impossibly far away, or perhaps impossibly close, came a sound. It was like breathing, slow, patient, and eternal, waiting for them to come just a little bit closer. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more unsettling tales from the SCP archives and beyond. See you next time. The first hour passed in tense silence, broken only by the hum of equipment and the scratch of Helena's stylus against her tablet. She'd set up 3 additional sensors around the scene, each one feeding her data that contradicted the others in ways that just shouldn't be possible. Thomas stood at the monitoring station, his fingers dancing across keyboards, trying to make sense of the information flooding his screens. Rebecca maintained her position near the elevator, her eyes constantly scanning the corridor, though what she expected to defend against remained entirely unclear. Morrison had left them 20 minutes ago, citing other duties, but Helena suspected he simply couldn't bear to stay in the presence of the seam any longer than he had to. She understood the impulse. Every minute spent near that impossible crack in space felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing one step would send you tumbling into an abyss with no bottom. The temperature kept dropping. Helena could see frost beginning to form on the metal fixtures along the walls, delicate crystalline patterns that grew and spread like living things. Her breath came out in thick clouds now, and her fingers were going numb, despite the insulated gloves she'd pulled on. This cold, it wasn't natural. It came from the seam itself, radiating outward in waves that her instruments couldn't quite measure. Thomas called out from the monitoring station, his voice tight with confusion. "Dr. Grant, you need to see this. The temporal readings are spiking. According to these sensors, the area immediately around the seam is experiencing time at a different rate than we are." Helena crossed to his position, studying the data with growing alarm. He was right. The numbers showed that for every second that passed for them, nearly 3 seconds elapsed near the seam. Time itself was stretching, distorting around that wound, in reality like water circling a drain. That's not possible. Rebecca had moved closer, drawn by the urgency in their voices. Time doesn't work like that. It does here. Helena pointed at the screen, where the readings continued to climb. Whatever came through in 1977 didn't just tear a hole between dimensions. It disrupted the fundamental structure of space-time itself. We're looking at a localized temporal anomaly, and it's getting stronger. What happens if it keeps getting stronger? Thomas asked, though the tremor in his voice suggested he'd already guessed the answer. Best case scenario, Helena said, choosing her next words carefully. This entire level becomes unstuck from normal time. Worst case, the effect spreads upward through the facility and eventually reaches the surface. If that happens, we could end up with a significant portion of the Nevada desert existing in a permanent state of temporal flux. Past, present, and future, all occupying the same space simultaneously. The implications hung in the air, like the frost that now coated every surface. Rebecca reached for her radio to call Morrison, but all she got was static. She tried again, adjusting frequencies, but the result was the same. White noise punctuated by occasional bursts of sound that might have been voices, or might have been something else entirely. We're cut off. Rebecca's training kept her voice steady, but her hand rested on her sidearm now. Whatever's happening down here, it's interfering with communications. Thomas turned back to his screens, pulling up archived files from the facility's database. If this thing has been here since 1977, there must be records. Reports from the original team that encountered it. He scrolled through directories, searching for anything that might give them insight. What he found made his stomach drop. There were files, dozens of them, but most were corrupted beyond recovery. Fragmentary reports that cut off mid-sentence. Video logs that showed nothing but static. Audio recordings that contained only that same breathing sound they'd heard earlier, patient and eternal. But one file remained intact. A personal diary entry from someone named Dr. Patricia Reeves, dated March 14, 1977. Thomas opened the file and began reading aloud, his voice growing quieter with each sentence. Day 47 of observation. The visitors continue to display remarkable properties. They exist outside our conventional understanding of linear time, moving through it as easily as we move through space. Communication attempts have failed. I don't think they perceive reality the way we do. Yesterday, Jenkins got too close to the aperture. He's still standing there, frozen at 1432, unable to move forward into the next second. We can see him aging in real time, years passing for him while minutes pass for us. By tomorrow, he'll be dead, still trapped in that single moment. I've recommended immediate evacuation of Level 7, but Dalton insists we can control this. He's wrong. The visitors don't want to harm us. They don't even really see us. We're just accidents waiting to happen, caught in the wake of something so far beyond our comprehension that trying to understand it is like an ant trying to understand quantum mechanics. The entry ended there, cut off mid-thought. Thomas searched for more files from Dr. Reeves, but found nothing. It was as if she'd simply stopped existing after that final entry. Helena felt ice forming in her veins that had nothing to do with the temperature. The visitors. Reeves had written as if there were multiple entities, not just one. She turned back toward the scene, studying it with new eyes, and for the first time noticed something she'd missed before. The distortion around it wasn't uniform. There were patterns, rhythms, almost like movement. They're still here. The words escaped her lips before she could stop them. Whatever came through in 1977. They never left. They've been on this side of the seam the entire time. Rebecca drew her weapon, her hands steady. Where? I don't see anything. You're not looking at the right time. Helena pulled up a specialized filter on her scanner, one designed to detect phase-shifted matter. The screen lit up with shapes that hurt to look at, forms that existed in more dimensions than human eyes could properly perceive. They're all around us, moving through seconds we've already experienced or haven't reached yet. From their perspective, we're probably the ones who seem frozen. Thomas backed away from the monitoring station, his face pale in the emergency lighting. How many? Helena's voice was barely audible now. Dozens, maybe more. And they're coming closer. The breathing sound grew louder, no longer distant but immediate, as if something impossibly large had just exhaled directly into the corridor. The frost on the walls began to move, patterns shifting and reforming into shapes that almost resembled writing. Almost, but not quite. Letters from an alphabet that had never existed, forming words in a language no human throat could pronounce. Rebecca moved to position herself between Helena, Thomas, and the seam, her weapon trained on the space where the distortion seemed strongest. Fall back to the elevator. Slowly, no sudden movements. They began retreating, step by careful step, but the corridor seemed to stretch as they moved. The elevator that had been only 50 feet behind them now appeared to be hundreds of yards away, receding like an image in a funhouse mirror. The distance between each footstep felt wrong, too long or too short, as if space itself had become elastic and unreliable. It's playing with us. Thomas's analyst mind was breaking down the impossibility, categorizing it, trying to make it fit into patterns he could understand. It's manipulating local space-time to keep us here. Helena stopped moving. Her scientific curiosity, that same quality that had gotten her assigned to this project, now focused with laser intensity on a realization that changed everything. Wait, if they experience time non-linearly, if they can move through it freely, then they already know what we're going to do. Every action we've taken, every decision we'll make, it's already happened from their perspective. So we can't escape. Rebecca's voice held steady, but her grip on her weapon tightened. They've already seen us try. Not necessarily. Helena's mind raced, connecting pieces of a puzzle she'd only just realized existed. If time is fluid for them, then causality might work differently too. We might not be trapped by what we will do. We might be trapped by what we've already done. The shapes in Helena's scanner moved closer, their forms becoming more defined. She could almost see them now, even without the device. Beings that existed in a state of perpetual becoming, neither fully present nor absent. They reminded her of photographs, caught mid-exposure, blurred and ghost-like, except these ghosts were more real than anything she'd ever encountered. One of them reached out with something that might have been a limb, or might have been an extension of its being, through folded space. It touched the wall near Thomas, and the concrete aged instantly, decades of decay compressed into a single moment. Cracks spread like spider webs, and dust that should have taken years to accumulate came pouring out. They don't mean to hurt us. Helena spoke with sudden certainty. They're just so different from us that their mere presence causes damage. Like a human walking through a spider web. We're not trying to destroy it, but our scale and nature make collision inevitable. The entity that had touched the wall turned what might have been attention toward Helena. She felt its regard like pressure against her thoughts, not hostile, but overwhelming in its intensity. And in that moment of contact, she understood something that made her gasp aloud. They're not invaders. They're refugees. Something's hunting them. The realization hit Helena like a physical blow, forcing her to grab the wall for support. The entities. They weren't aggressors. They weren't explorers. They were running, hiding in the folds of time itself, seeking shelter from something that pursued them across dimensions. And humanity had just stumbled into their sanctuary. We had unknowingly made Level 7 a refuge for beings fleeing a threat beyond all comprehension. Thomas saw it too. The mathematical patterns in the data suddenly made a terrible, chilling sense. The temporal distortions weren't attacks. They were defensive measures, desperate attempts to hide from something that tracked its prey through normal spacetime. Every spike in the readings, every single anomaly we had recorded, it was the equivalent of someone holding their breath while a predator passed by. Rebecca lowered her weapon slowly, her tactical training useless against this new reality. "They're afraid," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper of disbelief. "Whatever these things are, they're terrified." Just then, Helena's scanner picked up a new reading. Something was pushing through the seam from the other side. The temperature plummeted, frost turning to thick ice that crackled and groaned as it spread across the concrete. But this cold felt different. It wasn't the ambient chill of the refugees' presence. This was sharp, predatory. It was winter with teeth and a terrifying intention behind it. The entities in the corridor contracted, their forms compressing, pulling away from the seam. Helena could feel their fear, now an emotion so pure and primal, it transcended the barriers between species and dimensions. They were trying to make themselves smaller, less noticeable, like prey animals freezing in place, hoping the hunter would pass them by. Something emerged. Not physically, not entirely, but enough of it pushed into our reality that my mind recoiled, refusing to process what I was seeing. It was hunger given form, emptiness that consumed everything it touched. Where the refugees existed in multiple times simultaneously, this thing existed in no time at all. It was the absence of moments, the impossible space between seconds, where nothing should exist, but something did. The monitoring equipment exploded in a shower of sparks. Thomas threw himself backward, rolling away from the wreckage. Rebecca moved on pure instinct, positioning herself in front of us. A human shield with a useless weapon against a creature that didn't fully exist in our dimension. But Helena stood transfixed. Her scientific mind was recording every detail, even as her survival instincts screamed at her to run. The hunter swept through the corridor, like a wind not made of air. It moved past the cowering refugees, searching, and where its attention fell, reality itself seemed to thin and fray. The concrete walls became translucent, showing glimpses of other times, other versions of Level 7 from the past and future. Helena saw Morrison, standing in this same corridor but decades older, his face lined with regret. She saw herself as a child, playing in a backyard she'd long forgotten. She saw the facility in ruins, abandoned and reclaimed by the desert. Then the hunter found what it was looking for. One of the refugees, maybe it was injured, or just unlucky, couldn't compress its temporal signature enough to hide. The hunter fell upon it with terrible efficiency. There was no violence, no struggle, just sudden absence. The refugee ceased to exist across all timelines simultaneously, erased from past, present, and future as if it had never been. The remaining entities scattered, fleeing deeper into the facility, phasing through walls and floors, desperately seeking any space where they might hide. The hunter paused, as if considering whether to pursue or continue searching this particular fold in spacetime. For a terrifying moment, Helena felt its attention sweep across her, and in that instant, she understood something that made her soul ache. The hunter wasn't evil. It was simply doing what it was designed to do, fulfilling a purpose as natural to it as breathing is to us. It maintained balance. It prevented paradoxes. It was cleaning up temporal anomalies that threatened the very stability of the dimensional fabric. The refugees were disruptions, tears in the careful order of cause and effect. The hunter was just setting things right, one deletion at a time. But knowing that didn't make it any less terrible to witness. The hunter withdrew back through the seam, its immediate hunger satisfied. The temperature began rising slowly, ice melting into water that pooled on the floor. The distortions faded, reality reasserting itself into familiar, stable shapes. But the silence that followed felt heavier than before, weighted with loss and the horrifying knowledge of what existed beyond our comprehension. Thomas was the first to speak, his voice shaking. We have to seal it, not just level 7, the seam itself. We have to close it permanently before that. That thing comes back. Helena wanted to argue. The scientist in her wanted to insist they could study this, learn from it. But she knew he was right. We had glimpsed something humans were never meant to see, touched mysteries that existed specifically because they remained hidden. Some doors, once opened, could never be safely walked through again. But what about them? Rebecca gestured at the empty corridor where the refugees had been. If we seal the seam, they'll be trapped here with us. And eventually, that hunter will find them all. Helena closed her eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She'd spent her entire career pursuing knowledge, believing that understanding was always worth the cost. But standing here, in the wreckage of human arrogance, she realized that some truths carried prices too high to pay. Sometimes mercy meant ignorance. Sometimes the kindest thing was to look away. We give them a choice. Helena's voice was steady now, certain. We open the seam wider, just for a moment, long enough for them to return to wherever they came from. If they want to take that risk, to face the hunter in their own dimension rather than hide in ours, we give them that option. And then we close it, forever. Thomas worked quickly, using the surviving equipment to calculate the energy requirements for Helena's plan. It would take everything the facility could generate, a controlled overload that would either widen the seam temporarily or cause a catastrophic explosion that might take out half the mountain. The odds weren't great, but they were better than leaving things as they were. Rebecca called Morrison, and this time the connection held. She explained the situation in terse, military language, stripping away the existential terror and reducing it to operational parameters. Morrison was silent for a long moment before responding. You have authorization to proceed. God help us all. We spent the next 2 hours preparing, running cables, and configuring generators, turning level 7 into a massive energy capacitor. The refugees emerged cautiously from their hiding places, drawn by the activity, somehow understanding what Helena intended. She could feel their gratitude, wordless and profound. Emotions that transcended language, finding expression in the subtle warping of light around them. When everything was ready, Helena placed her hand on the activation switch. She thought about Dr. Patricia Reeves, frozen somewhere in 1977, still trying to warn people who would never hear her. She thought about Jenkins, aging to death in a single trapped second. She thought about all the people who'd stood in this corridor over the decades, trying to understand forces that existed specifically to defy understanding. The choice we make here matters, Helena spoke, as much to herself as to Thomas and Rebecca. Not because it changes anything in the grand scheme of the universe. We're still tiny, still insignificant compared to what exists out there. But we get to choose who we are in the face of that insignificance. We can be destroyers, or we can be bridges. We can hide from what frightens us, or we can show compassion even to things we'll never fully understand. She pressed the switch. The facility's generator screamed, pouring energy into the seam. It widened, its edges rippling and tearing, becoming a doorway instead of a crack. On the other side, Helena caught glimpses of impossible vistas dimensions, where physics worked differently and time flowed in directions human minds could unfollow, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The refugees moved toward the opening, one by one, returning to a home they'd fled in desperation. Some of them paused as they passed Helena, and she felt their touch against her consciousness. Not words, but meaning. Thanks and sorrow and hope, all compressed into a single moment of connection. The last refugee hesitated at the threshold. It turned back, and Helena understood it was offering her something. A gift, perhaps, or payment for kindness shown. She felt knowledge flowing into her mind, equations and concepts that would take her decades to fully understand. Glimpses of how the universe really worked, the hidden architecture beneath observable reality. But she also felt the price that knowledge carried. The burden of seeing too much, understanding too deeply. The loneliness of being the only one who knew certain truths. She accepted it anyway, because that was who she'd chosen to be. The final refugee vanished through the seam. Helena held the switch down, keeping the doorway open for one more second, then two, making sure they all made it through. Then she released it, and Thomas initiated the collapse sequence. The seam contracted rapidly, its edges drawing together like a wound finally healing. There was a sound like reality, sighing in relief. And then, nothing. Just three people standing in an empty corridor, forever changed by what they'd witnessed. Thanks for watching.